Members and guests, it's my very pleasant duty to introduce MP Jack Batty. Jack was elected as the member for Bragg in the State Parliament in July 22 election. Jack took over the seat, which was previously occupied by Vicky Chapman. He is the member for Bragg. Now, if any of you, and I think a few of you, don't know where Bragg is, if you take Kensington Road all the way from the Britannia roundabout up into the hills and take that as the bottom of an upside-down triangle, then proceed south to form a point to the Cleveland Conservation Park, almost to Stirling, that's Jack's fiefdom. And he has been serving us very well since he started there, although unfortunately I live on the wrong side of Kensington Road. The thing, you should have read Jack's extensive CV, which is incredibly impressive, so I'm assuming you have as good Rotarians, but what stood out for me was a first-class degree in honours in in law, and the next one was scoring a job as an associate to Justice Basanko in the federal court. Now, scoring a job as an associate to any job is a much sought-after position and really is a fast-track way to very, very quickly get into multiple legal fields, as it were, multiple different cases. So I'm going to stop there because you should have read his CV, and I'd like to introduce the Honourable Jack Batty MP.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me along today to the Rotary Club of Adelaide. I'm a very proud member of the Rotary Club of Burnside, actually, but we best not tell them that I'm here today, I don't think, lest they think it's some sort of act of treachery on my part. But I'm very excited to be here as one of the newest members of the South Australian Parliament, getting elected at a by-election in the seat of Bragg nearly 2 years ago. And I want to acknowledge my predecessor here today, the Honourable Vicky Chapman MP, who served in that capacity for, I think, 21 years as the member for Bragg. So I've got very big shoes to fill, but I'm glad she's here today, keeping an eye on me, making sure I'm sticking to my lane, not getting up to no good. But it's a pleasure to see her. It has been a bit of a whirlwind the first 2 years once you get elected to Parliament. It's a really steep learning curve, and I've got lots of stories that I could tell you from the past couple of years and my experience of what it's like to be a new Member of Parliament. But I'm told you're not interested in hearing about any of that today. And if there's one thing I have learned since becoming a Member of Parliament is that you should try and give the people what they want. So I am going to give the people what they want, which is to hear nothing about my brief political career, and instead try to talk to you a little bit about my previous career, which was a job in diplomacy for a few years, working over in the United Kingdom for the Honourable George Brandis QC when he was the High Commissioner for Australia to the United Kingdom for a period of time. So what I'd like to talk about is a little bit about my own personal reflections during that few years overseas, but also in sort of my own view, what the role of our overseas missions, our high commissions and embassies are and should be. Because I think there's a bit of a perception amongst some that it's all fancy diplomatic parties and, talk fests. And it mainly is. But there's also a lot of very important roles that I think our overseas missions perform. And what I want to use this presentation to do by way of personal example is to try and, I guess, make the case for having a strong overseas presence as a country. So kicking off, I've got a few slides where I try and sort of, I guess, in my own reflections, think about what I view the role of an embassy or a high commission. And for those that don't know, an embassy and a high commission is pretty much the same thing. A high commission is just what we call our embassy when it's in a Commonwealth country. So in the United Kingdom, we've got a high commissioner at a high commission. In the US, we've got an ambassador at an embassy performing the exact same roles. The ambassador and the high commissioner are the head of that mission overseas. And the head of all of those missions, and those missions in general, has an important job in two respects. One, I put to advance Australia's national interests, and I've listed a few ways in which they do that, including trade, influence, promotion, cooperation, and learning. And they're the sort of key things I want to address in this presentation today. The second broad role, I think, of a High Commission or an embassy is to protect Australians overseas. So when an Australian finds themselves in trouble, whether it's trouble medically, whether it's trouble with the law, one too many drunken nights out in Bali, there's a role for a High Commission to provide consular assistance and protect Australians overseas. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And the way I want to talk about it is through an example of each of those things during my time overseas. So I mentioned trade, and I want to talk about the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement that was negotiated during my time away. I mentioned influence, and I want to talk about climate policy and the COP26 conference in Glasgow that took place while I was away. Cooperation, I think, is a really important role for an embassy, and in that respect I'll talk about the G7 conference that took place when I was away in the early stages of the AUKUS agreement. Promotion, and there's a number of things in our public diplomacy programs I want to touch on. Learning is really important. We don't need to reinvent the wheel over and over again if other countries are doing things well. And I'll talk a little bit about the role of us reporting, and we had a general election in the UK during my time there and what the role of the embassy was. And then conclude by talking about our consular function and perhaps the biggest consular crisis we've seen in a little while, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm going to try to, I'll spend a little bit longer on some of these than others, but I'll race through them a little bit quickly so we can leave time for a few questions, hopefully. The first, and I think one of the key functions for all of our overseas missions is a trade function. And this was really well illustrated during my time over in London, because we negotiated the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement. And I've got two photos on the screen. Both of them are very bad photos, actually. One photo I'm in, one photo I took, but the dates are the reason I put them on there. The first photo was on the 15th of June 2020, and that's the day that we launched negotiations for the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement. And it's a photo of the High Commissioner, George Brandis, with the then International Trade Secretary, Liz Truss, who perhaps might be better known to many of you as Britain's shortest-serving Prime Minister now, but at the time was the International Trade Secretary who we spent a lot of time with over in London negotiating the Free Trade Agreement, which was agreed in principle exactly 1 year later. And that's a photo of the then Prime Ministers Scott Morrison and Boris Johnson in the garden of number 10 Downing Street, where they exchanged sort of Tim Tams and Vegemites and announced this gold standard trade deal. And it is a really important thing. It was and is a gold standard trade deal. Two-way trade between our two countries is already massive. You look at goods, there's two-way trade of $10 billion already. For us here in South Australia, that's nearly all wine, which is great news for our wine industry, I think. I think 2/3 of all of our goods exports to the UK from South Australia is wine. When I was going around Scotland talking to trade officials there about the deal, they quipped back, well, 2/3 of what we send you is whiskey. So perhaps there's a bit of an alcoholic theme, I think, to this trade deal. But it's not just wine. I think particularly for South Australia and our premium meats and seafood markets as well really stand to benefit. But also, importantly, services. There's an $11 billion two-way trade between our two countries in services. So this is about making it easier for professionals to do business in each other's countries, everything from the financial sector to lawyers and many others. Very, very important role indeed, but also mobility. So making it easier not only to work in each other's countries, but to live and work in each other's countries. So there's provisions in the trade agreement about particularly young people having the opportunity to travel and work in each other's countries, and also around particular skill sets we're seeking to get into Australia. So a gold standard deal both for Australia. In fact, it's our most ambitious we'd ever signed, other than our agreement with New Zealand. But also it was really important for Britain at the time. It was the first new free trade agreement that they'd signed since Brexit, and really sort of started to put the meat on the bones of what they were trying to define as their new foreign policy and trade policy. I think one interesting thing I wanted to touch on is just sort of how the sausage is made. What do we actually do there in the embassy while we're negotiating a trade agreement? And at all times, there's almost two streams of negotiation happening. One is with a bunch of very, very clever professionals, often lawyers or particular industry experts, who are locked away in rooms with each other, negotiating the minutiae of what ends up being a document that runs to 1,000 pages. So there were 4 rounds of formal negotiation, and you poke your head in on one of these rounds, and there's a whole heap of people in a room like this talking about telecommunications policy, and only telecommunications policy. And that happens for weeks, and then they go away and come back and they do it again for weeks. And at the end, you've got the telecommunications chapter. But there's a lot of chapters, as you're probably realising, so a very detailed process. What's happening alongside that is a broader political negotiation and debate. And I think this was actually pretty important in the UK. I think the sort of our friend from the UK might tell me different, but I think in Australia the debate for free trade, and free trade being a good thing, was run and won decades ago, and frankly by Labor governments. Whereas I didn't necessarily find that same starting assumption everywhere I went in the UK. And there was a section that was quite protectionist, and a section that was quite sceptical of free trade as a concept, particularly within sort of a backbench rump of the Tory party as well, frankly. So there was a debate and case to be made about not only the benefits of this deal, but almost making the case for free trade in general. And that happened in a lot of different ways. There was sort of a macro sort of campaign that we ran where we'd have the High Commissioner speaking at events like this, travelling around, meeting with farmers in Wales and talking about farming policy to them, engaging with various stakeholders, think tanks, and a lot of members of Parliament hosting them to try and make the case for our free trade agreement. But then also a really sort of micro campaign on the decision makers. So I mentioned before Liz Truss, we spent an enormous amount of time with. She's played croquet with me in the gardens of the Australian High Commissioner's residence. There's been some dodgy karaoke that's been sung. And all of these things were quite important in the event, I think, in building a relationship to try and get a deal done, which ultimately climaxed over a dinner, not dissimilar to this, where you had the leaders sitting at a table. I think the final point came down to how we were defining sheep meat, whether we're talking about carcass weight or shipped weight. And they eventually came to an agreement over probably a glass of Australian wine. And the High Commissioner wrote it on the back of a serviette, wrote it down and handed it to someone like me. It was sent back to Australia House, typed up. And by the end of the night, we had an agreement in principle. And that was the night before that photo on the 15th of June 2021. So I think both streams are really enormously important. That political stream, trying to get the deal over the line, and also the very technical stream being led by the officials on the detail of the deal. So that's a brief picture of how to do a free trade agreement, but I do think trade, certainly in my time in the United Kingdom, was one of the biggest things we were working on. That was the job when we arrived, and it was really exciting to be able to be there the day we launched negotiations, and then the day that we ultimately signed the deal. And I think sort of encouragingly for us sitting here at Adelaide Oval, the deal was signed virtually between the two countries, and one party in the UK was in London, where I was, and the other party was in Australia and was in fact in South Australia, of all the places. And I think it might have even been right here at Adelaide Oval where it was ultimately signed. But I do think that, at least symbolically, if nothing else, shows how much we've got to gain out of these deals and those that will follow. So trade, a key important factor for our embassies and high commissions. I think another key role of an overseas mission is to influence the country that you're in. You want sometimes them making decisions that are in our best interests, and you can do that sort of softly or sometimes a bit more heavy-handedly. One example, which I've got some photos up of here, where we spent a lot of time, was in climate policy. And we spent a lot of time on it because it was in the lead up to the COP26 conference that took place in Glasgow. And we did a lot of work, not only just at that conference, and there's photos about how we influenced there. We had a stool set up, and we engaged in a lot of panel discussions, and we of course had our officials there at the negotiating table. But also a lot of work in the lead up, whether it's work at Australia House here. There's a picture of the High Commissioner signing a deal with Kwasi Kwarteng, who was the business secretary at the time, now known as Britain's shortest-serving chancellor. But he was signing a clean energy agreement at the time, and it's about influencing that country about the approach we wanted to take to climate policy and trying to get a deal that was more palatable to us at the end of it. So I think influence is a really important role of a High Commission or an embassy overseas. Thirdly, I think there's an important role for simply cooperating, working together for a mutually beneficial outcome. And that can often only happen when you've got people in the room talking about issues. It happens, I think, in two ways. One, on a bilateral basis. So the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement is an example of a bilateral deal between two countries for their mutual benefit. But also, and increasingly, on a multilateral basis. So the example I've got here was the G7 conference that took place in Cornwall during my time over there, and Australia was invited to participate in that, and of course we accepted that invitation because we want to be around that table cooperating and shaping policies going forward. And it was there that the early stages of the AUKUS agreement between then it was President Biden, and it would have been Prime Ministers Johnson and Morrison, was nutted out, and we're seeing here, particularly in South Australia, the ongoing consequences of that sort of cooperation at that stage. Fourthly, and this is some of the fun stuff, this is the parties, promotion. We want to promote not only Australia, but the Australian story, Australian people, and Australia's interests overseas. And basically all of our missions around the world have what we call a public diplomacy program and a public diplomacy team, and it's their job to engage in some of that softer diplomacy. And I saw it a lot in the UK in various respects. So the photo on the far left was one of many royal events in the UK that we participated in. That's the only photo I've got, unfortunately. I wish I had a better one, but that's me with the late Her Majesty the Queen in the background at the Royal Australian Air Force 100th anniversary at Runnymede. But we engaged with the royal family quite a lot. For example, we hosted an event following the Australian bushfires that Prince Charles kindly came and spoke at. There was always royal attendance at Anzac Day or Remembrance Day. We had the Princess Royal most recently, and we had Prince William as well during my time there. So engaging in that sort of softer diplomacy, particularly in the UK on the royal side. In the middle, tourism is a really important thing to promote overseas, and that's a photograph launching sort of the reopening of Australia's borders following following the COVID-19 pandemic. We do it a lot through the arts and also sport. So the top right-hand photo is the launch of what was called the Season of Culture, the Australia-UK Season of Culture, which was billed as the largest cultural exchange between our two countries. And then the bottom photo is some of our sports diplomacy program. That's with some rugby greats that attended Australia House. I've got no idea about the game of rugby, but apparently some of those people are reasonably famous, but it was lost on me. But we had the Australian cricket team come, we had the Australian women's football team come, and many more in between. And frankly, it's easier to get people in a room when you've got the Australian women's football team there than when you've got the travelling Attorney General in town, for example. And we've got to use these opportunities, I think, to promote us and our country and our interests. So a very important promotion role, which is mainly fulfilled through our public diplomacy program. The fifth thing that I've got here about how I think we advance Australia's national interests overseas is simply learning. So there's a lot of places around the world who are doing things really, really well. And there's a lot that are doing things really, really badly. And I think we need to learn from both of those examples. Someone, when I arrived in the job, sort of described the role of a diplomat as part-time investigative reporter and part-time spy. So you have good diplomats who are on the ground developing relationships to then report back to Canberra about what's happening in that home country. And we report back through sort of regular cables and reporting mechanisms, and that's really important because sometimes we need to respond to those events, sometimes we need to influence those events, but often we just want to learn from those events. So you've got a photo of me here at the front of number 10 Downing Street, so you'll go in there, you'll try and meet with people, you'll say what's happening today, you'll develop relationships with the advisors and the ministers and the members of parliament to try to be able to report back to Canberra what's happening on the ground. And an example of that I've got on the right-hand side there is a photo I took, I think about 3 a.m. in the morning inside Conservative Party headquarters when Boris Johnson had just arrived after being re-elected in 2019. But being able to talk to people there on the ground in that sort of part investigative reporter spy type role and let our colleagues in Australia know what was happening and what sort of impact that might have going forward. So I think a really important learning role from an embassy or high commission overseas. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about what I sort of view as a separate role. So one being to advance Australia's national interests overseas, and then the other main role being to to protect Australians overseas. And there's a really important consular function that our embassies and high commissions perform. And that was perhaps no better demonstrated than during the pandemic when the borders shut. What we were dealing with was a genuine consular crisis on the ground. At any given time, there's over 1 million Australians out of the country. And they all suddenly needed to get back in a hurry, and all of the planes stopped flying. So we had literally homeless Australians camped out at Heathrow Airport for a period there that we were trying to support and frantically trying to get home, often to relatives who might be sick or whatever else. So there was a lot of pressure that people were under. And what was undertaken was one of basically the largest peacetime repatriation effort that Australia has ever undertaken, where we flew a lot of those Australians home, but served as a bit of a front door for their problems and issues while they were still on the ground as well. We also did a lot of work around vaccines and getting vaccines into the country, and there's a couple of photos signing a deal there with the then Health Secretary, Sajid Javid. I don't think he was in the Truss government, so I can't make a joke about him. And that's a photo of us on the tarmac at Heathrow Airport loading vaccines onto a plane. So I did go over thinking it would be fancy diplomatic cocktail parties, but instead found myself in that yellow vest loading Australians onto a plane at Heathrow Airport. So an extraordinary turn of events. So there, in my mind, very, very quickly, the sort of major roles of what I see a High Commission or embassy doing overseas. We've got hundreds of them around the world, and hopefully that's just a small defence of their presence, and it's somewhat interesting for you today, but very happy to take your questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. I'm just wondering, how do you promote something you might disagree with, especially as a diplomat, and how do you deal with that personally?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I guess sort of part of my background before this was as a lawyer, where you're trained to take on that case and argue it almost sort of with some of the emotion and passion removed from it. And I think good public servants can do that as well, and effectively that's what I was when I was overseas. I was a public servant, a civil servant, and you're there to serve the government of that day, whatever the political persuasion might be. I think good public servants advise as well, and they're not afraid to put their case forward and their views forward, and very good ones can do so in a convincing way and help to shape that sort of policy. But at the end of the day, you're there to serve and serve the country, and you make sure that what the government of the day wants is being delivered as well.
Sorry. So about every bad spy thriller has like a secret agent stealing something from an embassy that's heavily guarded in some vault in the basement. What kind of role does security and secrecy play in a practical life? I mean, you have to basically check your phone 3 times a day, or how does this kind of like work?
If I told you, I'd have to kill you. Yeah. You're dead right. We are hugely security conscious at our overseas missions. Basically, we're told to assume we're being watched on arrival, and we assume our phones are being tapped, and I think a lot of that's probably out of an abundance of caution, but a lot of it's a very real threat. So there's siloing of information. There's various levels of security clearance that you have or you don't have, which means there's certain sections of the building you can and can't go into. And then there's sort of normal security procedures we would have all been through as well, but particularly on the cyber side. It's not a building you could walk around wearing your Apple Watch, for example. That all gets left at home or at the door. Hugely security conscious. There was actually one of the James Bond's films, just as an aside, that was filmed inside Australia House in the foyer there. That was this beautiful old building. For those who might have visited London and walked past it on the Strand, but you walk into what's called the exhibition hall there, and it's quite a popular location for filming, whether it's James Bond or it's actually most famously the Hogwarts bank from the Harry Potter movies. They filmed the bank scenes there full of gremlins and trolls. So you'd often arrive at work and have to sort of fend off children dressed as wizards to try and get through the door. Well, Julian was probably our most high-profile consular case. Any given time, the embassy had, a number of consular cases, and he was another one. I had a little bit to do with it, actually. I attended a lot of his court hearing at Woolwich and at Belmarsh Prison, near Woolwich there, and also at the Old Bailey. I wasn't providing a sort of consular function, but more sort of a reporting type capacity, making sure that his consular needs were being looked after, basically. But so the embassy had a role to play, just as they do for all Australians that find themselves in trouble with the law overseas.
Negotiations for the free trade deal, there are those of us who remember when there was free trade before the common market. Was there any discussion such as, why don't we just simply do what we used to do?
Well, at its core, yes. And we actually sort of invoked a lot of these more emotional and passionate arguments looking back to the days before the common market. And the day that I think Britain entered the common market, there was serious angst amongst farmers in particular. I think this very day that I had the photo of the Rose Garden, Boris Johnson tells stories of farmers committing suicide, really enormous pressure. So I think that was almost the case we're making, given this was the first new free trade agreement post-Brexit. It was an opportunity for Britain, I think, to pivot back to an old friend, back to the Commonwealth, and to see that there's actually a world of opportunity out there beyond the protectionism of the common market and the European Union.
We've got time for a couple more.
I don't think it will ever be complete. I mean, I was there the day that Brexit came into law, and there was all sorts of, bizarre parties in the streets and things like that. But I think the fundamental problem with Brexit was it never defined what it was. The country went to a referendum, and the question, frankly, was as simple as, do you want Brexit, yes or no? And my experience, at least over there, was certainly the 3 years. For 3 years, they spent trying to figure out what on earth Brexit actually meant. And that, frankly, ground the country and certainly the political class to a halt for 3 years. I think they're nearly out the end of it, but it's going to take a while longer yet. And our friend from the UK might have better insights than me now.